So now it's my time, Max here. I have the honor of starting with you in this course section where we are going to apply what we learned and build a complete project where we will use Git and GitHub to then manage the code. And we're not just going to do this on our own with one person contributing to the project, but instead, in this course section, you're going to see the complete flow. We're going to start building that project and setting up a real web development project together, locally in a local Git repository. But then we're also going to move that code and push that code to GitHub so that it's stored there, but also so that we can manage it there. And as I said, we're not just going to do this alone, but instead we're going to work on this project together from a certain point on in this course section, and we're going to collaborate with help of GitHub and by merging different branches together into our main and master branch, and of course also by having a look at how we could use pull requests for collaborating on this project. Now, speaking of the project, here's what we're going to build. This is a simple website which is built with React.js. Now, React.js is a library, a JavaScript library, which you don't need to know to follow along in this course section. It's totally optional. It's not related to Git or GitHub. It's just a popular library for building modern web user interfaces. And we got a complete course on React.js if you would want to learn more about it. But again, you don't need to learn it just for GitHub, and you also don't need to learn it to follow along here. Because we're not going to write a lot of React code, instead we're going to provide the code to you because we simply just want to practice how we can work on that code and add new code features with help of Git and GitHub. Now, the project which we're going to build is this very simple food order app where we got a couple of meals to choose from, where we can add meals to our cart, which then updates here in the top right corner, where we can also add different quantities, and where we can view the cart and then also manage the cart items here in the cart if we want to. It's really just the UI. There is no database behind the scenes. The order button also won't work because it's just a dummy app, a dummy website user interface, which we will use to apply our Git and GitHub knowledge. Now, if you do want to follow along, attached to the next lecture, you find a starting project snapshot, which we will use and with which we will get started in the next lecture. But you will also need to install an extra tool to follow along. You will have to visit nodejs.org to download and install Node.js, the latest version of it. Node.js is a JavaScript runtime that allows you to run JavaScript, which is a programming language that normally only runs in the browser, outside of the browser. Now, we're not going to leverage that this much, but we need Node.js on our system to work on our React.js project, because it turns out that for this React.js project, to manage it efficiently and to run it locally on our system for testing, we need Node.js behind the scenes. That's why you need to download and install it if you want to follow along. If you don't, you can of course ignore this. It's not a tool that you need for Git or GitHub. Here you can also see that I seem to be on macOS here, and indeed I am, but all the steps I show you in this course section, or we show you in this course section, will work exactly in the same way on both macOS and Windows. There are no differences there. And with that, let's now dive into this React project. Let's get started with that, and let's see how we could work on this more realistic project with Git and GitHub. So let's get started working on this more realistic project. For this, as mentioned in the previous course lecture, attached you find a starting project snapshot, which you can download and extract. It's a zip file. And then you can open the extracted folder with Visual Studio Code, as we did it many times throughout this course. Now, I won't talk too much about the files you find in there. This is React.js code, and as I said in the previous lecture, you don't need to know React.js to follow along, because we're not going to write a lot of code together. It's just there so that we have something on the screen. Now what we have in the end here is a SRC folder that contains the main source code of this project, of this website. And if you go through that folder, you will see a bunch of JavaScript files and a couple of CSS files. CSS is a language that's used in web development for styling things, so for controlling how things look like. And JavaScript is used for adding logic, for controlling what's showing up on the page, how things should change if a button is clicked, and so on. And React.js is a library that simplifies building complex user interfaces with JavaScript, which is why you will find a lot of JavaScript files in this project. Again, the files that you have here in the starting snapshot are files which you don't need to change right now. Instead, we're going to make some changes together. Now, before we do that though, let's see which project state we have here as a starting state, because it's not the finished state. Instead, I removed certain features so that throughout the discourse section, we can add them together. And to run and build and view this website, which uses React.js, we need this Node.js tool that I mentioned in the previous course lecture. Because we will need to run a certain command to, first of all, install and get all the dependencies this React.js project needs to work correctly, so a bunch of third-party libraries that are used. And we then need to run a command that will spin up a local development web server, which is not accessible by anyone else, but just by us on our local machine, which allows us to preview this website. Now, for both things, for installing the dependencies and for starting this dev server, we can open this terminal, which is integrated into Visual Studio Code. And in this terminal, and it doesn't matter if you're on Mac or on Windows, as mentioned before, you can run npm install. This is a command that should be available after you installed Node.js. It's the Node package manager, which we're using here, so it's part of Node.js, so to say. And if you hit enter, this will install a bunch of dependencies that are listed in package.json. Again, the details here don't really matter to us, but these are packages that are required to then run this React application successfully. Now, this can take a couple of seconds or minutes, and once it's finished, and it doesn't matter if you get any warnings here or anything like this, once it's finished, you can run npm start, another command which we can invoke with help of npm, and this will then start this development server, which I mentioned before. This can also take a short while, and at some point it should have started, and you should then be able to visit localhost:3000 in your web browser, in Chrome for example, to preview this website. Now, very important, right now, this website won't work as I showed it to you before. Especially clicking on your card won't do anything, because that's exactly the part which we will add together here in this course module. And therefore, let's get started with this. And of course, we want to track our changes with Git and GitHub, because that is why we use Git and GitHub, so that we can work on a project without facing the danger of introducing changes which are hard to roll back or of losing our working state. So, time to get started with Git and GitHub on this project, which we set up in the previous course lecture. To get started with Git and GitHub, I will now quit this development server, which you, by the way, should keep running as long as you work on your code, but now I'll quit it temporarily by hitting Ctrl+C. Now, with that quit, once we are able to enter new commands in the terminal again, we can run git init to initialize this project as a local Git repository. So if we hit enter, this is initialized here, and I immediately get a warning that there are too many active changes in this Git repository. Now, I get this warning because it turns out that this React project, and actually many modern web development projects, does have an extra folder with a lot of content inside of it. In this case, the Node modules folder. This folder contains all the dependencies which we installed before with npm install. Now, it turns out that all these third-party packages themselves often have a lot of dependencies, and therefore this folder has lots of content, lots of files, and it's a bit too much for Git to track efficiently. Now, the great thing about this node modules folder is that we can always delete it and then recreate it by running npm install. Because the dependency names that we need are logged in this package.json file, and hence npm install knows what to install whenever we run this command. Since this is the case, the node modules folder is a perfect example for a collection of files that we don't want to track with Git. Because we won't actively change those files, these are all third-party dependencies, not managed by us, but by other people, so we don't want to change that code anyways. And it's too much for Git to track it efficiently. Therefore, what we typically do as one of the first steps in many projects, including this React project, is that we add a .gitignore file, about which you learned throughout this course, of course, which allows us to define files and folders that should not be tracked by Git. And in this case, we can simply add node modules to tell Git that the folder named node modules and all the files inside of it should not be tracked. Whilst I'm here, I'm also going to add the .ds_store file, which is a Mac-specific file, which I also don't want to track, but which doesn't matter too much here. The more important part is node module, because by ignoring this, we ensure that we're not trying to track a lot of unnecessary files. So once we save this, it gets grayed out here in Visual Studio Code, indicating that it's not being tracked. And now in our new Git repository that we created with that gitignore file that we added, we can now add our first commit for that starting state of this project. And we can do this with git add dot to select all the files and folders that are not ignored in this project folder. And then we can, of course, commit this with git commit -m. This allows us to then create a commit based on all these changes that we staged. And we can add a message with -m here, which could be initial commit, since that's exactly what it is. It's our first commit for the initial project setup. Now we see the log here that a lot of changes were added to this commit. And with that, if we now run git status, we of course see that now we got nothing to commit and we got this project, this repository set up successfully. Now, one thing we can do here is we can rename this main branch here. If we type git branch, we see that it's named master, and we might want to change this to main, which can be done by running git branch -m, and then the name which we currently have, in this case master, and then the new name we want to assign to this branch, in this case main, for example. And now it's renamed. This is of course optional, but the convention kind of is these days to prefer main over master, and therefore I renamed it here as well. With all of that done, I'm going to run npm start again to start that development server again to have a live preview of this website. And now we can start working on the code and then see how we can commit our different code changes with help of Git.